If the parents will work with the school and work with their children and in a cooperative way and encourage, it goes a long way in the child's education. I spent 12 years at Hodgenville, rode the bus 12 years, uh, started first grade. I think, there were 12 of us that graduated that started in first grade. So we went through 12 years of school together. Uh, Miss Sarah was my first grade teacher. I think she was about everybody's first grade teacher till she retired, Miss Sarah Sterling. And I lived on a dairy farm, so I had to milk a cow before I could go to school. And I thought all first graders milked cows before they went to school. I was very disappointed when Miss Sarah told me that I was the only one in the class that had to milk a cow. But we had 12 good years. They were great big classes. Miss Walter Cole had us in fourth grade, and she had 89 fourth graders. We were in a classroom where the desks were side by side. She would tell the first row to get up, and then they would move the second row over so the second row could get out. Our desk, we were a sea of desks. Poor Miss Cole, she resigned from LaRue County Schools that year and went to Fort Knox. Because she really had it. But they were closing the one-room schoolhouses, and they weren't prepared for it, is what was happening. And so she got 89 kids that year. Fifth grade, they decided that we needed 2 teachers for that larger group. And so they divided us into 2 groups, and we stayed into 2 groups until 8th grade. And back then, people needed their sons to work. And so our class dropped down. After 8th grade, it dropped down to about 45. And when we graduated, there was 39 of us because of the needs of people back then. 8th grade education, and they thought that was enough because they needed them to either work on the farm or get a job and help. And then I went off to college for 1 year, and the next summer, Jimmy and I got engaged, and we decided we'd get married and go to college together. And Mr. Haney called me. He was the superintendent of schools. And he said, "Joyce, I hate to ask you this, but I've got 2 classrooms I cannot find a teacher for." And I told him, I said, "Now, Mr. Haney, I'm not aiming to be a teacher. I'm going to college to be a veterinarian." And he said, "Oh, Joyce, I've got a 3rd grade and a 5th grade, and if you would just stop 1 year of college and teach that class, I promise you I'll send the supervisor to help you the first 2 weeks to show you how to do it." Well, Jimmy and I were aiming to get married, so we thought, "Oh, that's great. I'll teach school for 1 year." And I made a great big salary of $89 for the whole year. $89. So I went in, and the first 2 weeks, Mr. Haney was, to his word, he sent me the supervisor up there, and she stayed with me, was Miss Hamilton, which eventually became the state superintendent. She was very good. She taught me a lot. She would have made a magnificent college professor because she really knew what she was talking about. And she stayed with me for 2 weeks and showed me how to do things. And that's how I got my start, really. I was fresh out of high school. Yeah, I was 19 years old. As one parent come in the room, she looked at me and she said, "You're kind of young, ain't you?"
You grown.
I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm a little bit young." I took off a year to have 2 children because you didn't teach back then and pregnant. it was awful for children to see you pregnant. So I had to lay off, and I had my two children within that 11 months apart. So I had my two children, and Mr. Haney called me again after my second one was born. He said, Joyce, I hate to call you, but one of our teachers died. I said, which one? And he told me, and I said, oh, I'm sorry. He said, but I've got a first grade, and I don't have a teacher. And I said, but my little boy is just only 4 weeks old, Mr. Haney. I just can't do it health-wise. He said, if you just go in there and sit with those little first graders and make sure they don't get away, said, that'll be all right with me. I said, okay. But who can go in and sit and watch first graders not learn? So those poor children had 7 substitutes that year because the teacher had been sick all year. There was 36 of them, and only 2 of them could read, and this was March. So I told him, I said, we've got to get busy. You've got to get your first grade in. And I told him, I said, you've got to learn to read. Well, there wasn't any books. There wasn't any pre-primers. All we had was the first reader. And so I called Mr. Haney and I told him, I said, now you want me to teach this first grade, but so you've got to get me some books. So he got me some books. And we were on our way. And those little kids, I told them that if they would work real hard, we'd have a party the last day of school. And we got every one of them reading before school was out. But it took lots of work. And then from then on, I decided, well, it's not a bad profession. I was getting behind on my veterinarian degree anyway. And the veterinarian that was going to sponsor me, I told him, I said, I think I'm going to go back to college and be a teacher. And he said, I think that's great because veterinarians is hard work. I said, well, I'm just substituting pets for little ones. I said they need the same care as the pets, so that's how I became a teacher. I went to college then, and they passed a law at that time that all teachers had to have their degree. So I sat in the classroom at college with my first grade teacher, my second grade teacher, third, fourth, and fifth grade teacher. We were all in the same class in college. Most of the high school teachers had their degree, but not the elementary teachers. Of course, they didn't pay very much, so it wasn't an incentive to go into the profession. But I had 2 small children, and I love little kids, so that worked out great. I taught Hodgenville 4 years, and then the rest at Magnolia, 24 years at Magnolia. Well, when I went to Magnolia, the second year they sent me to Magnolia, and then they brought me back to Hodgenville for 3 years. But everybody was kin to my husband. They were all cousins, so I wasn't used to that. So we had a good year. Miss Tab was my principal, and I was the only one that was in my 20s. I was 24 years old. No, I was 20 years old when I went to Magnolia. And everybody else was in their 50s and 60s. And so I was called the youngster. And so I went to the first grade, and I was there 18 years in first grade. And we went through the spell. Miss Tab didn't think anybody should talk. I don't know whether she was doing that when you came or not. Nobody should talk. And that's part of learning, is talking. It was early 70s. That was a progressive program where we did centers, children would go to centers, and basically we did that in first grade anyway. We was a pilot school for Western, and in the summers we'd go and teach in the lab schools. There was three head teachers for each school, and there was 6 counties in Kentucky that was chosen by Western to be in this group. And we had lots of visitors. Our school was full of visitors. They took the walls down in the school, so we had open rooms, and we had 2 teachers in each room to take care of children, sometimes 3. Renee Skaggs and I had 108 children in one room, first graders, one year. And if one of us got sick, there wasn't any money for substitutes that year, so you were left with 108 first graders if the other one got sick. So we tried very hard not to get sick that year. Renee and I worked real hard that year, but we got them all. We had them all reading, and they knew their basic math. So if you can get them reading and their basic math, you have them in a good start. There was no kindergarten at that time. So, but schools really changed, thank goodness. Then Martha Lane came along, our governor, and she decided that the heavy classrooms were not to be anymore. And she's the one that worked to get our classrooms down in size. She's a very smart governor. She'd been there, too many classrooms with too many numbers. And so our classrooms went down in size, and our education got better. She did a lot for education. I'm real grateful to her for that. She really did. She's the only really governor that's really worked hard about getting numbers down and getting teachers where they can manage children. We've had a long history of too many kids in the classroom. There were 7 of us, so Mother had to get us all on the bus in the morning was quite a routine to get all 7 of us on the bus in the morning. When I was in elementary school, there wasn't a attendance clause for education. If you had 800 children, you got paid for 800 children, whether they came to school or not. And so we didn't have snow days. The buses would run where they could and pick up the kids that they could, and we'd take our sleds. We put our sleds on the school bus, and you might be, I know there was like 45 in one class, and one snow day there was only 4 kids there because that's all the bus could pick up. We had our sleds, so we went outside and played. But now when they changed the law where you have to be there, now we have snow days. But it was fun when it wasn't when it was the other way. You had a big, of course I was at Hodgenville, and we had the big hill. So they closed the street in the front. They closed that street in front of the school, and we could ride up and down the hill. But now you have snow days. That's one big difference from when I was in school. I think we still have trouble with not enough books. All the years I taught, I don't think I ever had enough books for every child to have a book. I think we still have that problem. There's not enough money for books. I had Cheryl. Cheryl came from Campbellsville. She was going to school at Campbellsville University, so she was my student teacher. And so the next year I had her as she was my fellow teacher the next year, which I enjoyed. She was very good. Her husband's a minister, so she's been to several schools. We had a lot of Fort Knox soldiers, their wives. And so we had a big turnover of teachers for a while because it was Fort Knox soldiers. Their wives would take on a second job. I don't think we have that anymore. I don't think the schools, Hardin County may have it, but we don't have it. But At one time, we had a lot of soldiers' wives. The walls went up. Yes.
The walls came down, and then the walls went back up,
Mhm.
and they went back to teaching straight grades.
Right, straight grades again. Right.
Yeah.
I liked the walls out. It gave you more room. I mean, it really did. I only had the only time I had a desk that I could call my own was the first 2 years I taught. And then the rooms were so crowded, I told them to take my desk out because it took too much room. And so my stuff stayed in a basket over in the corner, so we could put more, so the kids would have more room in the classroom. But when you're dealing like first graders, most years most of them I had from 42 to 57 by myself. And when we had the open concept, we had over 100 for 2 teachers. I stayed down in that same section that you were in, first grade. I was in a real bad car wreck, and injured my knees, and I stayed on my knees in first grade. I don't like to stand above children as I'm teaching them, and so I stayed on my knees. And after the wreck, I asked Mr. Sanders, I said, I need somebody to take my first grade position, because I said my knees are not going to hold up. And so he gave me Renee. She was going to be my first grade teacher to take my part. And then we were together 3 years, and then he decided that Hodgenville needed a good kindergarten teacher, so he took Renee. And so then Kathy came down to Magnolia, and I asked Kathy, I said, would you be a first grade teacher? And she took my part. My knees weren't going to have first grade. So we switched around, which I really appreciated, because I didn't feel like I was doing a good job with first graders at that time. Let me tell you another one. That when I went to Magnolia at Hodgenville, the principal took care of the small children who couldn't pay for their lunch. At that time, you had to be able to work to get free lunch. And so when I went to Magnolia, the first day I had 6 children who didn't have lunch money. And so when I went to the office to turn in lunch money, the principal told me, she said, those 6 children stay in the classroom while you take the rest to lunch. And I said, no. I said, they don't get to eat lunch at all? And she said, no, they have to bring their lunch if they don't have their lunch money, because they're too small to work. And so I said, well, I reached in my pocket, and lunch was 12 cents a lunch then. So I gave her enough to cover those 6 children for that day. And I wrote a note to their mothers to tell them to bring their lunch the next day. Well, they didn't bring their lunch. They were poor, and they didn't have any lunch money. So they were doing good just to eat at home, much less bring it to school. So the next day, for the next 2 weeks, I paid for their lunch. And the woman, Miss Jessie Miller, who was the head of the lunchroom, found out that I was paying for these 6 children, and she told me, she said, you stop that. She said, we throw enough food away to feed lots of children. And she said, we'll figure out a plan on getting those children fed without you paying for it. And she did. On my plate, I would have 7 hamburgers and 7 plates underneath. And so I'd just take my plate, and then I'd give all the children that didn't have lunch money. But back then, it wasn't, children weren't provided with free lunch. And Miss Jessie took care of those 6 children for me that year. 1989. I'd got my real estate license. We went into real estate together, my husband and I, in 75. So I had a second job all through it. But in 1989, we built a new office, so I decided then it was time for me to go to the office and leave these young girls the opportunity to take care of all the children. 28 years. Started when I was 19. Camelsville, yeah. I got my degree by going in the summer times and at night. In 6 years, I taught. In the same 6 years, I got a 4-year degree, had 2 children, and taught 5 years of school in the same 6 years. I was young. I was young. But in the summer times, we would ride. I got to know my elementary teachers because we rode over together to college in the summertime. And they graduated. 3 of them graduated with me that I went to school under. Kickball. Everybody played kickball. The only thing that was different, we played marbles. I don't think kids know how to play marbles. But we played kickball and duck, 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 and all those games when I was a kid at school. Yeah. If you look through some of those annuals, you'll see where you can count the kids in classrooms. It's high. Well, when I first started teaching, the parents came in and said, I want my children or my child to get as much out of school as they can. And if they don't behave, you let me know, and we will work on it at home. And all you had to do was write a note. Of course, most people didn't have telephones at that time, which is unusual right now because everybody's got a telephone. But you'd write them a note, and the child would be different because he would come, his mind would be on his studies and everything. The last year I taught, I had this one little boy who he wasn't going to sit in his seat whether I asked him to or not. And the parent came up and asked me, he said, well, what did you do to make him behave like that? So we went from one extreme to the other extreme. What did you do to make that child act like that? And when I first started, it was, I want my child to learn. So we'll make sure he behaves. And I think the attitude is still that same as if when I quit. And my grandson is a teacher. So my grandfather was a teacher. He had an interesting career. Every August he would get on a train and he would take the train to Denver, Colorado, and he would teach school there for the year, and then in April when school was out, he'd get back on the train and come home to Mumfordville, is where he was from. And it's because Mumfordville at the time didn't have room for a high school teacher, and Denver, Colorado had openings for teachers in the high school. And he would tell the stories like the old westerns on TV about how the cowboys or the bandits would rob the train. And of course he said, I was a teacher, so I had no money. And he said they would get on the train and make you empty your pockets and then let you sit back down, and then they'd get off the train, and then you'd continue your journey out west. But he did that for 15 years. Would get on a train and go to Denver, Colorado. And then I became a teacher. My mother was a librarian. And then I became a teacher, and now my daughter has retired from teaching. Now my grandson is a math teacher at the high school, Eric Allen, and he's a baseball coach. I had Mr. Haney and Mr. Sanders as two. I went to Ohio to do a workshop for Ohio teachers in math, and the first meeting was with the superintendents of Ohio. And Cheryl and I were the two that went to do the workshop, and so we got up, and I introduced myself that I was from Kentucky. And one of the superintendents said, "What can Kentucky teach Ohio superintendents?" And then one of the other guys said, "Be quiet and listen to her." So after we got finished, he came up and apologized. He said, "You do have a good program." It was how to teach math in first grade, higher up math, algebra, and so forth. And they were wanting a new math program. And so the book company sent us up to tell them about our math program. But the first thing came out of his mouth, "What can Kentucky teach Ohio?"
But you did.
But we did. They were very impressed with us because they had no idea there was math programs out like that. You stand in front of a bunch of superintendents, and the next day we worked with teachers, and of course teachers were ready to listen about new programs. So, but the superintendents, I think they were a little bit annoyed that a teacher was going to tell them something. And from Kentucky. That was under that program from Western. That was a good program. There was 5 counties. They set up cameras in our classroom. They would give us objectives to reach. Like I had to teach one lesson. I had to teach my first graders how to do basic algebra, and then they took them back to the classroom and used them as teaching tools. That was when you had the huge video cameras and you had a big box, that they recorded them on. Our schools benefited from that program. They supplied a lot of materials and hands-on stuff. They brought students up to work with us. People that thought they wanted to be a teacher, which they need to do more of. Need to put college students in classroom. I had an uncle who went through 4 years of college. His mother was a teacher, and he thought that he wanted to be a teacher. He got his degree, got him a job. First day of school, he went at 12 o'clock that day. He went to the office, gave him his keys. He said, "You find yourself another teacher. I can't take this." And he left, and he never went back. He went back to college to get him another degree in something else. It happens to a lot of them. They need to put them in the classroom and let them see what's going on. You invest all that money in it and then find out. That's just like nursing. If they don't put them in soon, they don't find out, and then they've got all that money invested. And we could use the extra help. People ask you, "What grade do you teach?" "First grade." "Oh, that's an easy grade to teach."
And you know that now.
My grandson said this summer, he said, "I was always told the teachers had 3 months off in the summertime." He said, "I've had 3 weeks." If you want your child to have a good education, you have to be involved.